The Ottoman Empire, spanning 6 centuries and 3 continents, was a colossal engine of power and conquest, but beneath the gilded ceilings of Topkapi Palace lay a secret so dark, so necessary, that it defined the very nature of their succession: the law of fratricide. This wasn't just occasional dynastic murder, it was an official state policy, codified by Sultan Mehmed II, the Conqueror, himself in the late 15th century, known chillingly as the Law of the Fati. It decreed that whichever son secured the sultanate had the right, indeed, the divine obligation, to execute all his brothers to ensure peace. The logic was brutal but simple. Better one royal murder than a decade of civil war. The Ottoman state was often plagued by relentless, costly succession battles among half-brothers, each claiming divine right. Mehmed II declared, "Any of my sons who ascends the throne may rightly kill his brothers in the interest of the world order." The lives of dozens of princes were weighed against the stability of an empire. This mandate created an atmosphere of absolute terror within the harem. Every new birth of a royal son was a potential death sentence for the existing princes. The harem became a viper's nest where mothers, each fighting for their son to survive the cull, plotted ceaselessly. The throne was not inherited, it was wrestled for in blood. The greatest secret of the Ottoman dynasty is that even after this law was changed, the fate of the princes became even worse. The final, terrifying act of a prince locked in the Kafes was not fear, but a secret journal detailing his insane pact with the silent executioner. Don't you dare look away. Watch this entire, deep dive documentary, and subscribe to this channel, and you will learn the one shocking secret that prince, who spent 43 years waiting to die, recorded in his final moments. But how did the executioners kill the princes without shedding royal, sacred blood? The method was a quiet, insidious ritual that terrified the royal family for centuries. The blood of the Ottoman dynasty was considered sacred, derived from the great Oghuz Khans. It could not, under any circumstances, touch the ground. This meant that the executioner's axe, the common tool of capital punishment, was forbidden in the harem. The sultans needed a method that was both silent and ritually clean. They chose the silk cord. This was a chilling ritual carried out by mute executioners. The bastanchi, palace gardeners, who were often deaf to prevent them from hearing any pleas for mercy. When the new sultan issued the order, the bastanchi would approach the condemned prince's chamber. The prince, who had spent his life preparing for this moment, would often greet them with calm resignation. The executioners would offer the prince a bowl of sherbet. If the sherbet was white, it meant banishment or temporary reprieve. If the sherbet was red, it was the signal for immediate death. The prince would say his final prayers, and the mute executioners would then swiftly, professionally, dispatch him using the thick, unadorned silk cord, preventing a single drop of royal blood from touching the sacred palace floor. The sheer number of victims is staggering. Sultan Murad III ordered the execution of his 5 brothers. His son, Mehmed III, upon securing the throne, went further. He executed 19 of his brothers and half-brothers in a single night. This event, known as the Massacre of the 19, shook the empire and demanded a radical change. But one of those 19 brothers had a final, secret victim, a pregnant slave woman whose life was deemed a threat to the state. The sheer scale of Mehmed III's fratricide was unprecedented. 19 young men, some barely infants, all rivals, were strangled in a single day. But the cruelty didn't stop there. Royal tradition demanded that the newly appointed sultan also eliminate any women who might be pregnant with a rival's child. After executing his brothers, Mehmed III ordered the execution of all 17 women of his brothers' harems who were believed to be carrying children. This was not a quick execution. These women, many of whom were deeply mourning their murdered masters, were tied into heavy sacks and drowned in the waters of the Bosphorus. This secondary massacre highlights the absolute, chilling logic of the Ottoman system. No potential heir, no matter how remote, could be allowed to live. The women, the mothers, and the unborn children were all collateral damage in the brutal game of succession. This single night of horror cemented Mehmed III's name in history, a sultan who ascended the throne upon a mountain of corpses. The sheer, destabilizing horror of the Massacre of the 19 forced the empire to change its law. The alternative solution they devised, the infamous Kafes, was far more insidious and cruel than outright murder. Following the brutal reign of Mehmed III, the Ottoman Empire faced a crisis. The systematic murder of all male heirs left the dynasty dangerously fragile. If the new sultan died young, there would be no male line left, risking the collapse of the entire empire. The solution, implemented largely under Sultan Ahmed I, was the Kafes, or the cage. The Kafes was not an actual bird cage, but a luxurious, yet psychologically crippling apartment complex located within the deepest, most isolated section of the Topkapi Palace harem. Instead of executing rival princes, they were imprisoned there for life. This new system ensured that a supply of adult, male princes was always available to assume the throne should the ruling sultan die, but the psychological cost was almost unimaginable. Princes were locked away from the outside world, barred from military training, women, or politics. They lived in an environment of opulent paranoia. Their only companions were often mute servants or slaves who spied on them. The prince's life became an unending, agonizing wait. Every day could bring one of two outcomes: a promotion to sultan, or the arrival of the Bastanchi with the silk cord. This isolation, this constant psychological dread, guaranteed that many of the princes who eventually emerged to rule the empire were profoundly mentally unstable, unfit for power, or driven to severe madness. The most tragic victim of the Kafes was a prince who spent 43 years in isolation, emerging only to become a mad, confused, and utterly broken emperor. The Kafes was the Ottoman Empire's greatest psychological experiment, and it often produced monsters. Perhaps the most famous and tragic example was Sultan Ibrahim I. Ibrahim spent nearly 22 years imprisoned in the Kafes, beginning from childhood, perpetually expecting his older brother, Murad IV, to order his execution. When Murad IV died without a male heir, the officials rushed to the Kafes to retrieve Ibrahim and make him sultan. Ibrahim, utterly convinced this was a trap, initially refused to leave the cage, believing the Bastanchi had finally come to strangle him. He only accepted the throne when his mother, the powerful Sultana Kozum, had Murad's corpse brought before his window as proof. The years of isolation had left him profoundly unhinged. Once on the throne, his paranoia and mental instability spiraled into infamous acts of cruelty. Known as Ibrahim the Mad, he was obsessed with furs, mirrors, and, most famously, he ordered the drowning of his entire harem, 280 women, in the Bosphorus after a scandalous rumor, simply because he was convinced he was surrounded by traitors. The system designed to preserve the dynasty had instead delivered a mad tyrant. The Sultanate had exchanged the blood of fratricide for the blood of sheer, unadulterated madness. But the most disturbing discovery made in the Kafes was a secret journal left by a prince who knew he was next in line for the cord, a journal that revealed his terrifying, private pact with the executioner. The terror of the Kafes system gave rise to a new, powerful, and terrifying political force: the Valide Sultan, Queen Mother, and the Kadin Effendis, chief consorts. These women, confined to the harem, became the ultimate masters of political manipulation. They could not rule openly, but they controlled the ruler. The most infamous example of this power was Kozum Sultan, the mother of Ibrahim I. Kozum, a woman of extraordinary intelligence and ruthless ambition, orchestrated the political landscape from the shadows of the harem. When the Kafe system was implemented, the Valide Sultan's role changed. Her survival now depended entirely on keeping a male heir alive, not on securing a quick, bloody throne. Kozum became the chief manipulator of the system, often acting as the de facto ruler when her sons proved too mad or too incompetent. Like Ibrahim I, her job was to navigate the narrow line between keeping the sultan's brothers alive for succession and ensuring they were sufficiently mentally crippled by the Kafes so they posed no political threat. She had to manage the madness she herself had helped create. The harem became a silent battlefield, where mothers waged a war of whispers and poisons. Their ultimate weapon was the influence they had over their sons, the sultans, often convincing them to execute the sons of rival mothers based on paranoid delusions. This ensured that the terror of fratricide, though technically softened by the Kafes, was merely replaced by the quieter, deadlier terror of harem intrigue. The greatest secret of the Kafes was that its residents were not just isolated, they were subject to an insidious, terrifying form of psychological abuse orchestrated by the palace eunuchs. The Kafes wasn't merely a set of comfortable rooms, it was a sophisticated mechanism for psychological torture. The princes were forbidden genuine companionship. Instead, they were watched over by the chief black eunuch and his corps of mute servants. These men were the jailers, the spies, and sometimes, the executioners. The eunuch's primary job was to maintain the state of perpetual uncertainty that defined the Kafes. They would never provide information about the ruling sultan's health, nor would they confirm if a reprieve or a death sentence was imminent. This constant, crushing silence, punctuated by the faint sounds of life outside the walls, was designed to induce clinical insanity, to further ensure the prince's isolation. They were denied all meaningful education, especially military or political training. Any books or tutors deemed dangerous were instantly removed. Their world was reduced to shadows, rumor, and the crushing weight of their own racing thoughts. Crucially, while some princes were allowed non-procreative concubines, who were often infertile or controlled by the Valide Sultan to ensure no new male heirs were created, these women served only to alleviate boredom, not to provide true comfort. These women, often themselves prisoners, were the final layer of the psychological prison, reporting every word and every anxious sigh back to the controlling mothers. The prince lived in a world where every touch and every whisper was a form of surveillance. But the most shocking fact about the princes in the Kafes is that their madness was not only psychological, it was occasionally fueled by a bizarre, enforced dietary manipulation that weakened their minds. While the Ottoman Empire used the silk cord to avoid shedding blood, they were not averse to chemical manipulation. The goal of the Kafes was to preserve the body, but to destroy the will and the intellect. Historians have found evidence suggesting that the diet of the princes was secretly managed to ensure their political impotence. The diet provided to the princes, while rich in luxury foods, was often subtly deficient in crucial vitamins and nutrients required for long-term mental health. More ominously, accounts suggest the occasional, untraceable use of mild, long-term toxins or sedatives mixed into their food and drink. These substances, possibly derived from traditional Ottoman herbs, would not kill the prince but would induce chronic fatigue, memory loss, and mental sluggishness. This was a calculated strategy. A prince who was mentally enfeebled was a prince who could be easily controlled by the powerful Valide Sultan upon ascension. The Sultanate was literally built on the chemical and nutritional destruction of its own royal line. This weakness had profound effects. When a prince was finally released from decades in the cage, he was often physically weak, suffering from a range of debilitating conditions, and easily overwhelmed by the duties of the empire. The tragic cycle continued. Weakness led to poor governance led to instability, and instability eventually led to the same prince being deposed and often executed shortly after his supposed freedom. The most shocking example of this system's failure was the assassination of a powerful, capable sultan who was killed not by rivals, but by his own mother and the palace eunuchs, who feared his sanity and competence. The Kafes system was designed to protect the empire, but it bred an aristocracy of fear. The greatest threat to the established power structure of the harem and the eunuchs was not a mad sultan, but a competent one, a sultan who emerged sane, well-educated, and determined to rule independently was a threat to the Valide sultans and the chief eunuchs. This terrifying dynamic led to the downfall of Sultan Osman II. Osman, who took the throne in the early 17th century, was determined to break the parasitic power of the harem. He attempted to reform the Janissaries, move the capital out of Istanbul, and, crucially, limit the power of the Valide Sultan and the harem women. This was a death sentence. The harem establishment, led by the powerful Queen Mother, saw Osman's sanity and ambition as a direct threat to their control. They engineered a swift and brutal coup. Osman II was captured by the Janissaries, dragged from the palace, and, in a horrifying violation of the sacred law, murdered outside the palace walls. His blood finally shed on the common ground. This unprecedented execution, a sultan murdered by his own troops and sanctioned by his own family, proved the ultimate, terrifying truth of the Ottoman system. The crown of dread was held not by the sultan, but by the ruthless, hidden hierarchy of the harem, who preferred an insane puppet on the throne to a capable master. But the most disturbing finding in the archives concerns the princes who survived the Kafes and became sultans. Their final, secret diaries reveal an unbelievable truth about how they dealt with the constant, crushing fear. What did the princes do to survive decades of isolation in their gilded prison? The few surviving, highly censored accounts and fragments of personal diaries reveal a dark psychological coping mechanism that goes beyond mere madness, a terrifying, almost ritualistic pact with their inevitable fate. One fragment, believed to belong to a prince who eventually took the throne, details a secret agreement he made with one of the mute executioners, the Bostanchi. The prince was not begging for his life. Instead, he made the executioner a horrifying promise. If the executioner would tell him the truth about the current sultan's health once a year, the prince would leave the executioner his entire personal fortune after his death. This reveals the core desperation of the Kafes. The desire for knowledge outweighed the desire for life. The prince was so desperate to control the one thing he couldn't, his inevitable death, that he spent his wealth bribing the man who would eventually strangle him. The final, chilling entry in another prince's journal, written just days before his death, was not a prayer but a list of the 19 names of his executed uncles and cousins. He was preparing to join them, obsessively cataloging the victims of his own bloodline. The crown of dread was not an object of desire. It was a curse that consumed the soul long before the silk cord ever touched the neck. We have detailed the psychological torture, the chemical weaknesses, and the political horrors of the Ottoman Kafes, but the story isn't over. The final 5 blocks will reveal the terrifying secret pacts made by the Valide sultans, the long-term genetic decay the system created, and the final, shocking revelation of the prince who escaped the cord but was killed by his own insanity. We touched upon the horrifying secondary purge, the drowning of the concubines and enslaved women who were pregnant with a murdered prince's child. This was not a side note, it was a calculated, brutal ritual of cleansing. For the Ottomans, the Bosphorus, the strait connecting the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara, was the final, silent witness to the harem's cruelty. The act itself was swift and clandestine. The women, often 17 or more at a time, were tied inside weighted sacks. The chief black eunuch would personally oversee the operation. The sacks were loaded onto small, silent boats under the cover of darkness. They were rowed out to the deepest part of the strait and unceremoniously tossed overboard. This ritual served a twofold purpose. First, it eliminated the dynastic threat, the unborn male heirs. Second, and more symbolically terrifying, it purged the harem of scandal and potential witnesses. The Bosphorus became the empire's silent, flowing grave, washing away the evidence of the royal murders. The waters held the deepest secrets of Topkapi Palace, but the most shocking secret of the Kafes involves a ritual carried out by the prisoners themselves, a terrifying pact of mutual destruction made between the isolated princes. The princes and the Kafes, though politically isolated and deeply paranoid, were often imprisoned near each other, separated only by thin walls. Their shared fate, the constant, existential threat of the silk cord, led to a bizarre, horrifying form of camaraderie. They were not just rivals, they were fellow prisoners in the same gilded cell. Surviving whispers from the harem staff suggest that the princes, especially those who grew up together, often made a secret, final pact of mutual destruction. This pact was simple. If one of them was summoned to become sultan, that sultan had the obligation to immediately order the strangulation of the remaining brothers. This seems insane, but psychologically, it was a coping mechanism. The princes preferred quick death to the prolonged psychological torture of the Kafes. The pact was a desperate attempt to regain control over their own ending. The most agonizing thing was not the waiting, but the hope, the false belief that they might be spared. By agreeing to kill each other, they extinguished that hope and embraced the finality of their destiny. But the empire paid the ultimate price for this system. The genetic isolation and chronic instability led to an entirely new problem. The terrifying phenomenon of the mad sultan ruling the world's most powerful empire. The Kafe system, while succeeding in preventing civil wars, created an unforeseen and devastating long-term problem: the systematic decay of the dynasty's genetic and psychological health. For over a century, the Ottoman throne was filled by men who had spent their formative years in sensory and social deprivation. The princes were cut off from all outside stimuli, denied political experience, and often forced into marriages of convenience, further limiting the genetic pool. This resulted in a series of sultans who were increasingly ineffective, emotionally stunted, and profoundly paranoid, the ultimate example being Ibrahim the Mad. This period became known as the Sultanate of the Women. Because the true power resided with the Valide sultans and grand viziers who had to desperately cover up the rulers' incompetence, they had to manage a line of emperors who were often childish, hyper-sexual, or criminally cruel. The empire was ruled by proxy, constantly on the brink of collapse due to the instability of its own sovereign. The greatest betrayal of the system was the escape of one prince from the Silk Cord, only to be found by his family years later, living a horrifying secret life. Not every prince submitted to the cord or the cage. Records reveal the terrifying story of a prince whose name was officially erased, who managed to escape the immediate purge and flee Topkapi Palace. His escape was a direct challenge to the law of fratricide and a spiritual threat to the ruling sultan. This prince was hunted for years by the sultan's spies. He lived in disguise, a shadow in the empire he was born to rule. When he was finally discovered years later, he was not leading a rebellion or plotting a coup. He was living a simple, quiet life in hiding. Having completely abandoned his royal ambitions, the ruling sultan faced a terrifying dilemma: execute the prince and risk creating a martyr, or let him live and risk the law of Fadi being nullified. The sultan chose a punishment worse than death. The prince was captured, mutilated to make him unfit for the throne, likely blinded or castrated, and then returned to the deepest, darkest corner of the Kafes to live out his days, a living testament to the futility of resistance. We have witnessed the full, horrifying reach of the Ottoman blood law. Now, for the final, critical verdict. We must confront the moral cost of their brutal stability. We have unsealed the secrets of Topkapi Palace, the cold logic of fratricide, the silent terror of the Silk Cord, the drowning of the innocent, and the ultimate psychological prison of the Kafes. The Ottoman Empire paid an unthinkable price for stability, trading the blood of civil war for the madness of their rulers. The legacy of the Kafes is a chilling paradox. It saved the dynasty from extinction, but it destroyed the minds of the men who were meant to lead it. The crown of dread in Istanbul was not worn by a god, but by a traumatized man who was often a captive in his own luxurious prison. We have revealed the entire, horrifying truth, but now, we turn the final question to you. Crown of Dread audience, the Ottoman law of fratricide, the murder of all brothers for stability, was officially enacted to prevent devastating, long-term civil wars that would kill millions. Was this law, horrific and brutal as it was, a necessary evil that preserved the empire and prevented far greater bloodshed? Or was it merely the ultimate act of institutionalized royal tyranny and familial cruelty? Let the world know your verdict. Drop your opinion in the comments below, subscribe to Crown of Dread for more hidden history, and join us next time as we unearth the terrifying stories of blood and betrayal from the hidden courts of ancient China.